What is up, everybody? Gary Simon here. So today we're going to be talking about gradients in UI design. Recently I saw somebody on Twitter post about how they just can't use gradients. When they start using gradients, their design just starts looking like garbage essentially. And that's because they're tricky to use. So I'm going to be taking a single UI design that I created that's all flat or just solid colors. And we're going to see and examine the various ways that we can add gradients in a modern approach. And it's one of those things I'm also going to show you things that you shouldn't do. Because if you're a new designer, you're not aware of how gradients used to be used, and they were used very frequently back in the Web 2.0 era, back starting like around 2007 to like 2012 or so. And I'm going to show you what you shouldn't do in order to make your design look outdated, essentially. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. But first, make sure to subscribe. Now, wait 1 second. We're about to talk about gradients in UI design. And if you're not very good at UI design, I have to stress this. Please take my UI design bootcamp to sponsor this video, scrimba.com.
At Scrimba, you don't just watch videos. No. You're actually able to modify code in the browser while you learn. My course on UI design features over 100 lessons that are specifically tailored to help you become an awesome UI designer, and they're packed with interactive challenges.
So I can't stress this enough. Make sure you click on the top link here in the YouTube description to get access to my UI design bootcamp that will really help you become a great UI designer, along with many other courses that Scrimba offers. All right, here is a design that I created, and it is 100% flat with exception to these little gradient circles. But as far as the structure of the user interface itself, there's no gradients at all. Everything's what we would call flat. It's just a solid color that structures the color in the contrast of the layout. And this works 100% fine as is. So you can send this off to the front-end developer, and it's accessible. It's designed pretty well. All the colors work well with each other. Now the question as to whether or not you're going to should you use gradients really depends on the brand itself. What are you trying to elicit? If you're trying to elicit a more of like a playful, maybe a little bit less serious feel for your brand, then gradients are a great way to sort of reinforce that idea. Now, of course, there are exceptions. You can still have gradients in a serious setting, but we're going to talk about some examples here based on this particular user interface, and we're going to get started with the background. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this a bunch of times when working. So here's our original, pretty much no gradients, and here is one where we're going to add a gradient to the background. Now, typically, if you have a design like this, it's kind of like a containerized of the UI, and then you have a background around here, it's a lot easier to add the actual gradient. Now, when you're applying gradients, before I get started here real quickly, you have to really consider a couple things, really just 2 points. Really, it's one question though. Is the gradient going to be a background from which important elements will sit? So that important elements would be type. People need to be able to read it, or like icons or anything where people need to be able to use and interact and see. If that's the case, more often than not, maybe try to stay away from gradients unless you do it correctly, and I will show you a way to do that. But in the case of this, there's nothing sitting directly on top of here, with exception to this overall container. So you can go, it'll be a little bit easier to make sure that your gradients work well. Now, if you do have text sitting on top of your gradient, it makes the process of ensuring whether or not that text is accessible and has enough contrast a little bit more difficult. All right, so let's just take this background. And what you want to do when you're determining to use a gradient, I'm going to choose a linear gradient here, is you want to stick it within or close to the hues that are found and the colors that are found in the interface that already exist. All right, so this actually already exists here. We can see we have blues here. We have this desaturated sort of blue, light blue right here. And based on my previous color selections, it automatically chose this starting point, and it actually works pretty well. Now, typically I see on modern examples of using a gradient background, we see kind of like a 45-degree angle pattern instead of a vertical pattern. And especially, I really rarely see this sort of thing as well, although you could still do it. So there's a lot of subjective, options that you can take here. So this works. There's good contrast with the element that's on top of it, and you can't say that this one is objectively better or worse than this one. It's really just a subjective preference at this point. Let's do another one. What happens if we really try to crank up the brightness here? So let's see what happens. We're going to choose the first color stop, and these are little color stops. You can add more of them in to add more colors or hints, or not hints, but tints, shades, and tones. Let's boost this up, maybe all the way up here, which is our primary color, pretty much right down there. And then we'll take this one, and we could leave it this one. It kind of doesn't work well because it's this one's toned a lot. So in color theory, adding tone is just adding gray to the hue. I mean, as you can see, there's a gray right here. We could go over here. That could work. We could even go up here to maybe an analogous color. So an analogous color is simply or analogous hue is simply a hue or a color that sits close to it on the color spectrum. So this sort of purplish right here is very close to that blue. They're analogous to each other. And you could do this sort of thing as well. Now, for me personally, this is a little bit too much. The background's so bright that it distracts from the primary content and the focus right here. So I wouldn't go this route for a gradient background in this context. We'll leave this up though, just for reference. Let's see if we can go light. So this one's pretty dark. Let's see if we can go maybe a lighter take on this. So let's see here. I'm gonna look at my reference monitor because I created several of these. So let's take this gradient, and I'm going to come up here real light, like this right here. So it's pretty much 100% white rather. And maybe we'll take this one and we'll grab a color here that exists. And this is too much of a difference in my opinion. Again, it's too distracting with all of this bright color. But what if we come out over here? Ugh, that looks bad. Why does that look so bad? Well, this container right here, this column, if I delete it, suddenly it doesn't look so bad. But because this is pretty much a gray, if we look at it right here, it has just a little bit of tint of blue into it, or a hue rather. They don't contrast enough and they look really bad. So you have to make sure if you're using gradients that the elements sitting on top of it, certainly for text and important elements, but also other panels and such, that they contrast well with each other. So this I would definitely not do. You can add color stops in here. So if we take this one perhaps and move it to the middle, or we just place one here in the middle, and let's make this one maybe white. We'll take this middle one and maybe make it a little bit darker so that it contrasts well up here. This is potentially something you could do as well. So this, it's all about experimenting and ensuring that the contrast and the colors that are sitting next to each other complement each other and work well with each other. So that's one example. Now let's switch this up and start talking about other ways to use gradients. One very popular modern way to use gradients are on your calls to action, the big buttons. Gradients, especially ones that have two different hues, they really grab the attention of the eye. Right here, this blue background, let's go ahead and add a gradient to that. So we're going to do linear gradient, and this type of gradient is basically in the same exact hue. So if I choose this one versus this one, it's sitting in the same hue for this little picker right here. And that's just adding shade or you're darkening it. So you can do that, that's completely fine. But this particular aesthetic, the way it's set up for this gradient, this is kind of like an older school approach from the Web 2.0 era. What we can do is do that same idea where we just take this, put it over here, and that will work as well if you want to go that route, or we can change to an analogous hue for the second color stop. So we can maybe put this up here and brighten this up. Maybe we'll reverse these. So I'll just put this right here. All right, that works. And I like that. So it just gives you, it really brings the attention here to this button perhaps a little bit more. Let's give another example here. And let's talk about these cards. All right, so these cards, this could work without that particular background here or this column, but I'm choosing to use it just to make things a little bit interesting, at least for now. Notice that they have a stroke on them. So if I take this and I choose that stroke, we could actually get rid of the stroke and add a white. In fact, I kind of like this better, but of course we're not dealing with gradients just yet. But let's try to see if we can add a background gradient to these cards and see what that would look like sitting on this particular background. Can we make it work and make it look good? It's going to be tricky because there's a lot of type elements that are sitting on top of it. But let's just see. We'll take this, we'll go to gradient. And again, this is like a more old school approach. I definitely would not use this. Plus, it just kind of looks strange on this background. Let's just experiment here. Let's do that same idea where we're kind of doing this angled approach. Maybe we'll leave this white up here, and then we'll take this color picker. We'll get maybe our primary color blue. That's way bad. Don't do that. We're going to try to keep this as light as possible. So we could do something like this, but because this background here is sitting on it, this looks bad because of this. So we could say, all right, we'll just get rid of that. And this right here doesn't really look that bad. It's accessible still. You can still clearly see it. And you can also experiment with the positions of these, so in the length of the gradient itself. So if you want more white in here, perhaps you could drag that down. And you could do this sort of thing. I personally don't like it, but the number one rule is that it's still accessible. There's still enough contrast for people to access this information. Now I want to show you a different way to use gradients, and this isn't even a gradient. It's just a drop shadow, a soft drop shadow. So that's a gradient in and of itself because it's going from, usually a hue that you can see or a shade, and then it's just dropping off into nothing. So that's technically that is a gradient. So let's make this white, the background. Oops. Let's change that to solid rather. All right, so this is white, and the problem here is this is not necessarily a problem. There's enough white space to separate these, so they're not technically in containerized cards. But if we want to see those cards, given that if this is left as a white background, you can use shadows, and this will provide sort of like a gradient effect. So if we double click this and we choose drop shadow, and one thing I want to do based on using Adobe XD is pull this down so that we can see the shadows, and then I'll pull these away and then pull this back up. There we go. And let's start working with these shadows here. So we could take the X and Y, maybe push those like that. Where's the X here? There we go. So we're at like 13 by 13, and then big soft blur basically. So this looks cool. I actually like this. It allows you to see the cards, the card container. You don't want to go high contrast with your gradients or your backgrounds like this. So for instance, if we click in here and we drag this opacity slider up, that distracts from the content inside. Don't want to do that. Keep it minimal. But we don't have to go just grayscale as we see over here. We can actually have hue-based drop shadows, which, like I said, are complement gradients in and of themselves and are gradients in my opinion. So what we can do is just choose an existing hue that exists on user interface because we want to keep consistent. And this would be very bad. Just again, your shadows should be an afterthought. They shouldn't be the primary thought. So we can come down here and just choose something real soft. Look at that. I personally think that looks really cool. Let's look at another way that we can use gradients in this particular design. So now we have the background gradient, we have one for a call to action, and now we have these soft sort of shadows going on in our cards. What if we want to add a gradient here on the entire background itself? That would be a little bit nuts probably, but let's see how we could do that. So let's just experiment. Let's add a gradient. We'll go, I'm going to show you an old school technique of gradients, and it's kind of like the gloss effect. I don't like it. I don't advise doing it because it was so associated and used during the Web 2.0 era that it's just kind of outdated. So let's say, for instance, we did something like this, and let's make these both white for now. And then we'll add a color picker here in the middle. Let's get that gradient back out. Color stop rather. And for some reason, that's why. take this one and just drag that off. And let's add a little bit of a gradient there. We're not at the gloss part yet. What we want to do is add another one and maybe make this one just white as well. And then drag these real close to each other. And maybe even inverse them. So if I move this down, get it in the center of the text. Yeah, this is something that was done quite frequently in the Web 2.0 era back in like 2007 to like 2012 or so. And I just don't recommend doing this sort of thing. It's just, it's overplayed, and it's something of a bygone era. But let's see about different ways that we could do this in a more modern approach. So we'll take these, get rid of them. Let's get this situated. We'll stick with the theme of going diagonal. And let's see what we can do. Like we'll take this background. Can we take this and choose a color here and work with the tint or the shade to make something work? So this almost works, but you would probably want to take this background and make it solid because it's losing contrast in this section. So what we could do is just again, let's see here. Maybe we can just make a solid color for the background, and we'll use maybe this. Maybe we'll just make it light. Maybe we'll come down here. Something like that. So this could possibly work, but still, I don't really like it. What I see being done in a modern approach, given this particular idea of having a gradient on a background, is doing something like this. So we'll take this, and I do see this quite often. Even like this is kind of cool, where we see there's just a little bit of light adding like in the upper left or right corner of the design. We could take this. Let's see here. Maybe we'll add that. This one we'll make white. I wouldn't do this because there's not enough contrast now behind the logo, but hang with me. And then maybe we'll add another color picker, get an analogous situation here. Maybe don't make them so with so much hue over here to the right. So we'll take this. Let's see. And it's all about kind of just really playing with these and play with the length and the position of the color pickers. And so I might even want to go lighter on this background to increase the contrast. And of course, you could also add a background, drop shadow rather, on the interface itself, much in the same way we did with the cards. Just to give some separation, we'll grab this and then maybe we'll make it darker, or add in hue rather. Maybe we can make it like a really big blur. And so you could do this. This is a very subtle gradient, but it definitely adds something to the design. And I see stuff, like this being done, especially on shots on like Dribbble.com, the popular front page of Dribbble.com, and it definitely works. But most importantly, it is accessible still when compared. If we take this one right here and then compare it to this one right here. The contrast is still good, the accessibility is still good. We just have two different takes on a design, one that's flat and of course one that has a gradient. All right, everybody, hopefully you found usefulness out of that. And one thing I wanted to stress is in that final example, I had a lot of gradients in various places. I probably wouldn't take that approach just because it's a little bit too much, but add a gradient here and there is completely fine, especially in 2021 where, we're not still in that phase of where everything has to be flat. So definitely just take care and be extra cautious when you're using your gradients. And let me know what you thought here in the comments if I missed something or if you agree. Anyhow, I will see you all soon, and goodbye.